I'd love to get Dylan's take on CHIPS Act, right? CHIPS Act came out. Everybody was so excited, resurgence of the American semis industry, where the money's going.
Okay, there's 52 billions in direct sort of subsidies going out, and then there's the tax credit, which will probably be, I think the government said it would be 20 billion to get it passed, but in reality, I think it'll end up being like 30 to 40 billion for the tax credit. Call it 80 to 90 billion dollars getting injected into the US semiconductor industry. Just to be clear, there's over 100 billion being injected by China each year into the semiconductor industry, downstream and such. So it's yes, this 80 to 90 billion dollars over who knows 5 to 7 years, 5 to 9 years is great, but it's nowhere in comparison to what other countries are doing. This doesn't, while it slows the bleeding and does revitalize the US semiconductor industry to a decent amount, it doesn't completely turn it around,
Yeah.
right? A big chunk, I don't think any dollars have been allocated to the major projects quite yet. And this is part of the criticisms that people have had, is they've been a little slow in allocating money. And I think it makes sense, right? The CHIPS team didn't even get fully signed into the building until much later, right? While the bill passed, then they had to get allocated, and then they could start hiring the people, and then those people could start working on the framework for where they allocate money.
Though, if you were to play this out, you would think it'd be foundries because they want to reshore to reduce supply chain dependency risk around Taiwan, and that would suggest TSMC, they got a plant in Arizona, GFS, other foundries. Is that the right intuition here?
Yeah, so it's going to be companies that are building fabs in the US, not companies that already have fabs. So I think the biggest winners are, of course, going to be Intel, TSMC, Samsung, and they're battling, right? They'll all get the tax credit, but they won't all get money from the actual direct subsidy. That's not been allocated yet, but it's a very high likelihood that Samsung's Taylor, Texas, Intel's Ohio, and TSMC's Arizona all get probably half of the subsidies, if not more, in collective, right? And then Micron in New York and a couple other companies like that are trying to get some big chunk. Those are going to be the biggest, right? People who are building new fabs in the US. Global Foundries is not building a new fab in the US as far as I know, right? They're doing some minor expansions where they'll get a little bit of money for, but for the most part, they're building their new fab in Germany and in France, if I recall correctly, with ST Micro, and I can't remember the other company they're working with. So those companies, they're going to get benefits from the European money, but not necessarily the US money. And likewise, Intel's going to get a big chunk from the European money. TSMC is going to get a big chunk from European money as well, but it's all about who is building fabs. And so those are the major companies that I think will get money from the US, but there's also a huge chunk of the 52 billion. Something like 10 to 15 billion is allocated for packaging and research. And so that's the longer tail that there's very little clarity on what's going to make it, right? It's pretty easy to estimate, oh yeah, Intel's going to get X billion for Ohio. And it's not allocated. I'd bet like it's somewhere in a range, right?
So who would that be, like ASE and Amkor? That'd be the beneficiaries of that, or?
There's some startups as well. There's Albonics. There's another one. I can't remember the name of it. Albonics is in Georgia. And there's a few other companies that are doing packaging type work. And then there's a lot of like R&D, right? Like money hasn't been allocated to universities yet. I bet Purdue gets a big chunk, right? Purdue and Skywater. Skywater is a public company that's got a big deal with Purdue sign, and they're waiting to see what CHIPS Act allocation they get. But given that's one of the most comprehensive build outs of R&D and university and education, there's a big pot of money for education and training around semiconductors. I bet Skywater gets a big chunk, right? And then in New York, there's a pretty comprehensive proposal for research and development, right? From IBM and Global Foundries and Tokyo Electron and many other companies are working together on this R&D proposal. And probably that gets a chunk of money, right? A couple billion maybe. It's hard to say. There is going to be a long tail of small amounts of money as well.
That makes sense.
And I think, Ram, from the earlier stage investing side, that's what I've been looking at, particularly when you're looking at these labs. You have people spinning things out through technology procurement offices, capitalizing them with a little bit of money. But there is an expectation, hopefully at some point, as this CHIPS money starts getting released, and it might be in slow little dribbles, there might be a great tide when it comes to the R&D side. I do think there's a lot of optimism on the very early stage side that some of that capital will help build what might become some of the next great American behemoths.
That makes a lot of sense. No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that.